almost identically in long black coats and black hats, their hair curled in wisps down the edge of their faces. They spent their time with their heads buried in the Talmud, written in Aramaic. They were members of Manchester's ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. They're growing rapidly in numbers. In Manchester, they now constitute about a third of the Jewish population. Much of this is down to birth rate. They average around 7 children per family, 3/4 of all Jewish births in the UK. But they're also attracting members from other Jewish communities. In Israel, they play a key role in electoral politics. But what is their impact in this country? What do they believe? How do they practice? And how do they interact with those who sit outside their community? Joining me to discuss ultra-Orthodox Jewry are Rabbi Avraham Printer, principal of the Yesodey Hatorah School and a leading representative of the Orthodox community in Britain, Henya Myer, a member of the Hasidic community in Manchester, and Rabbi Dan Cohn-Sherbok, Professor of Judaism at the University of Wales, Lampeter, who belongs to the Reform Movement of Judaism. Avram, why do you belong to the ultra-Orthodox community?
I was born into it. It was something which happened, and it's the most wonderful thing that's happened to me. I couldn't ask for anything better than that.
Mrs. Myer, you've asked specifically to be called Mrs. Myer. Why is that?
To set up a small barrier to discourage too much interaction of the wrong sort.
Now, you were born into a family that wasn't particularly religious, so for you to become a member of ultra-Orthodoxy was a matter of choice.
Yes, it felt good.
What attracted you to it?
The warmth especially, and the structure. And when I got into it, I found what a wonderful supportive community it is. But it's the structure because it gives you a framework to develop individually.
Now, Dan, you're proudly Jewish, but you can't identify with the sort of Judaism of Mrs. Myer and Avraham.
No, I can't at all. My great-grandfather was Orthodox. He was a kosher butcher, but I grew up in a very different world, in the world of Reform Judaism. I know about Hasidism and I know about the Haredim, but it's not my world.
Now, you use the term Haredim, and those outside the community use the term ultra-Orthodox, and I know that it's regarded as a pejorative term. You don't like it, Mrs. Myer.
No, not particularly. In the old days, Orthodox was enough. And Orthodox simply means that we adhere to the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the body of Jewish law, which is the Bible and the Talmud, and the commentaries on it. And we do it as our ancestors did, as close as we can, over the centuries, so that we represent the continuity. So if you're Orthodox, you're adhering to the law. So ultra-Orthodox, well, what's that? I'm sorry, it's just a nice way of saying fanatic.
Dan.
It might be helpful to differentiate between what is called modern Orthodoxy, that's what the Chief Rabbi of Great Britain represents, mainstream Orthodoxy, and the Haredim, or the strictly Orthodox. They are very strict, very traditional Jews who want to isolate themselves from the rest of society and even from modern Orthodoxy itself.
But the distinguishing mark, Dan, is very firmly this belief that the Torah is given by God, infallible, authoritative for life.
That's true.
And that's where you part company.
I do part company because it's a central tenet of traditional Judaism and of Orthodox Judaism that God revealed the 5 books of Moses to Moses on Mount Sinai. And I just don't believe that, because modern scholarship demonstrates that it just isn't so.
Mrs. Myer, when I think of Haredi, I think of the gentlemen I saw today in the train in long coats and hats and side beards, and women with heads covered either in a hat or a wig. And I gather you're wearing a wig. Is that obligatory?
To wear a wig, no. But to cover, yes. For a married woman, when she gets married, her hair becomes something personal and private for her husband, because hair is regarded as a very attractive feature in a woman.
What about the men in these very strange uniforms, strange to modern eyes, that look like something out of 18th century Eastern Europe?
It's again to create a barrier. It's a protection, so that you're constantly reminded that you have a purpose in life, and your purpose is to serve God. We do have a very God-oriented life. Our function is to be a sort of priestly people, doing God's will, showing what can be done, having a close relationship with the divine.
The Haredim are differentiated by their way of life. They want to isolate themselves from the rest of the community. They have their own schools, their own institutions. They don't want to send their children on the whole to universities. They want to live a life very much like the life that the Jews lived in Eastern Europe in the 18th century, the 19th century. In a sense, they're like the Amish. They want to deliberately differentiate themselves. Wouldn't you say that is true?
No, I wouldn't.
No.
The comparison to the Amish, just if you take the modernity and technological breakthroughs, we will welcome those and we will use them. The difference is we see that there are some problems that the modern world brings us, and we will try to discern and make the separation, look what is the good from the bad.
When did the Haredi begin to settle in Britain?
The Jewish community started settling here 350 years ago. There was large-scale immigration, which the main time that took place in the late 1800s and the beginning of the last century. A small number of those practiced a Haredi lifestyle, but not the majority. The reason being because those people who arrived in those times were mostly refugees, and they chose England to escape the pogroms and the dire poverty which existed then in Eastern Europe. In other words, they made a choice. The most Charedi Jews arrived before and immediately after the Holocaust.
And they tend to settle in compact areas. For instance, in Manchester, there's a large community in Salford. I don't know if that's where you live.
You'll see generally the Jewish community have always done that. It's not just the Haredi community.
Because you need the infrastructure anyway. So particularly Frum Jews are going to settle in compact areas because you need to walk to synagogue on the Sabbath when you can't drive. You want your Jewish grocery stores with the kosher food. Your schools obviously are going to serve a small catchment area if possible. And besides, they're families and people who understand you. You don't want to live 10 miles away from the nearest person you can borrow butter from.
Avraham, you've mentioned the Holocaust. And the Haredi suffered more than most because there were large communities of Haredim all across Eastern Europe, and they were very easily identified. They were easy targets for Hitler's troops.
I think that every section of the Jewish community, I wouldn't say that the Haredi suffered more.
What would be true to say is that the Haredi communities of Eastern Europe and Western Europe were completely decimated by the Holocaust. This was the Jewish world in many ways, and it vanished as a result. So the Haredim have now settled in Israel and in the United States and elsewhere, and those are the major communities.
I wonder, is there a sense of nostalgia among the Haredi for those communities that they left behind in Eastern Europe, where they had been settled for many, many years? Is there a sense of nostalgia among Haredi communities elsewhere for those old days?
A very strong one, but in some ways it may be a little misplaced because our image of what the community was is based only on memories of people within our community, so they would only have known of the religious communities there. But there were a lot of secular Jews as well, and it's a movement that's largely ignored or avoided by our community because it was such a threat.
Dan?
I think there's a deep sense of nostalgia. It's a world of certitude, a world of devout devotion, a world of God-fearing believers, and in the modern world of secularism and scientific discovery, Jews are drawn back nostalgically to that lost world. I think
But it's not lost. You've just described our world.
It's a lost world in Europe.
We're in Europe.
But you're recreating, you're sort of artificially creating a community, a world that has vanished.
How do you mean we're artificially doing it? You mean because the government doesn't force us to live in ghettos, that we've created our own?
No,
That's for convenience.
I think there's a conscious attempt.
There's a conscious attempt to not shut out the world, but filter it.
For example, the clothing that men wear is obviously a nostalgic attempt to recreate a life of Eastern Europe. That's where the clothing originated.
But they've been wearing the same clothing for 100 years.
Let's look at the growth, and let's look at what's happening on the ground. I don't look at nostalgia. I look at the present. I look at the vibrancy that exists. It's life. It's real life. It's growing.
It's
the
continuity
of the Jewish people. That's where it all is, and that's where it's growth, and it's something real, and something, and it's a future.
Avraham, is there a sense that you're trying to replace those Holocaust victims, that there's a strong sense of 6 million Jews who were slaughtered in Hitler's camps.
And
you're trying to replace them, and therefore there are large families. I mentioned before an average of almost 7 children per family.
Subconsciously, that might exist. The miraculous rebirth and the growth of the Jewish community after nearly complete decimation. Yeah? Basically, he didn't win, and we've overcome. There is something in it, but to us, having large families, we see children as a wonderful blessing. They're the centre of our lives and central to our continuity.
Well, let me remind you that you're listening to Beyond Belief, and today we're discussing ultra-Orthodox Jewry. Members of that community dislike that description. They prefer to be known as Haredi, or strictly observant. They're the fastest growing section of Judaism. It's reckoned that by 2050 they will form the majority of Jews in Britain. What could that mean for the role of Jews in British society? Will they become more inward-looking? And with me are Avraham Printer, a Haredi rabbi, Mrs. Myer, a member of Manchester's Hasidic community, and Dan Cohn-Sherbok, who is a Reform Rabbi. How do the Haredi regard Jewish people who differ from themselves? Hillel Athias Robias was born in Costa Rica. He's now a Liberal Rabbi in North London, but he once belonged to a Haredi Congregation. He studied at a yeshiva in Israel. For him, the decision to become Haredi was a personal one.
Turning to ultra-Orthodoxy was a way of searching for meaning, of adding structure to our lives, adding patterns of behavior that we would find to be spiritual, divinely inspired.
But you must have been aware of tensions all the time, because at some stage during your teenage years you realised you were gay.
Yes. I kept it to myself during the first years. When I was 17, I moved to Israel and I went to study. My sexuality became more of an issue. It became a nightmare, actually. The fact that I wanted to be able to fulfill the commandments, to lead an observant life, and there was an aspect of me that would not surrender to this. So I started going to a support group for ultra-Orthodox gays, where they tried to do reparative or conversion therapy on me. On becoming heterosexual, which was something that they assured us was possible.
In fact, you married at the age, I think, of 21. Was that a personal choice of yours? Did you choose your bride?
It was what we would call an arranged marriage. There was a rabbi with whom I was open to about my sexuality, and he put pressure on me to get married. He felt that once within the framework of marriage, so my homosexual desires would decrease and I would move slowly towards heterosexuality.
Eventually you told your wife that you were gay. What was her reaction?
She obviously found it difficult, yet came to understand it, because how it's seen within the ultra-Orthodox world is as a sickness, just like any type of mental illness. And so she had compassion towards me and wanted to work with me towards reaching heterosexuality. The issue came when she disclosed it to her family living in Argentina, who were members of the ultra-Orthodox community. And within 1 week of her speaking to them, they had her take a plane to Argentina. She left me with my 3 daughters, told me she was going on holiday, and then from Argentina called me and told me she was never coming back.
Do you still see the children?
Yes, I see them twice a year and I call them daily.
How are you perceived by your wife and your family and by the rest of the ultra-Orthodox community?
As a heretic. Rabbis whom I had befriended, who had become almost like a father figure to me, I would call them and they'd simply hang up the phone on me, cut contact. People whom I would see in the street from my former life, many would just ignore me as if I wasn't there.
How do you regard the ultra-Orthodox community today? Because during your teenage years you were quite happy within it, and yet latterly it has disowned you.
Coming from that world, I do appreciate their positive aspects. As long as you follow the rules and are, let's say, within the fold, then life is great because you feel that you're always, every single second, fulfilling the divine will. The solidarity within the community is amazing. There is an amazing care structure. Yet at the same time, I realize that those people who in some way do not fit in, then life for them becomes a nightmare. Whether it is because they cannot follow the conduct which is asked of them, whether it is because they are gay, whether it is because the person is a woman who is not happy with the role she has within the community, then life isn't easy.
That was Hillel Athias Robias, who is now assistant rabbi at Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue. And he came to the conclusion, Mrs. Mayer, that there was no room for people like him in Haredi communities. Was he right?
It sounds as if he didn't continue with the therapy that he had originally started with. If what we are isn't consonant with Torah values, we're expected to work against that aspect of ourselves. Now, I realized that what he was going through was much deeper than just a desire to eat lobster or something. But it seems that perhaps with more support, he might have managed to maintain and deal with the problem that he had. And it is seen as a problem in our society.
I have to say, I think that is very moving, but a horrendous tale, because the notion of therapy to try to draw someone out of their sexual orientation is, to my mind, anathema. I do respect the Haredim, and I think that the Haredim community has much to offer. But I think that the narrowness of their vision is unfortunate, and they are not open to scientific discovery. They're not open to the modern world in the way that I think they should be. They're not open to the insights that psychology can provide about human sexuality. They are rooted to the Torah, and that will not free them to be open to the treasures of the modern world.
We don't want to be free. The whole point is that our function is to serve God in the way He asked us. He told us to.
Avraham.
Haredi does dictate a certain way of life. There are very strict moral values which the Torah dictates. If Dan doesn't like it, he's made his choice, and good for him. I'm not convinced that the person who told Hillel to get married actually gave him the right advice. If he felt, I respect the way he felt, that he couldn't control the inclination, he had to practice that way of life, then he has chosen not to be Haredi.
But you would say that this is a violation of God's will, and the Torah teaches this. Isn't that correct?
It says so specifically.
Hold on. The violation of God's will, if I would have unacceptable heterosexual behavior, would also be a violation of God's will.
But you can never condone homosexual behavior because of what the Torah teaches. Now, within the non-Orthodox world, within the Reform world, homosexuality is accepted in the United States. There are gay rabbis, gay congregations. We don't accept that every word, every commandment is binding. Because of this, we are open to the insights of modern psychology who have a very different story to tell you. I mean, you have to remember that the 5 books of Moses was written thousands and thousands of years ago.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we're insular, because things are happening today which would be unthinkable 30 years ago, to become normal, and I'm not willing to accept that.
I think that it's important that if he had wanted to stay Orthodox, then he would have continued with whatever help he could find. If you're going to define your entire identity by your sexuality, obviously it's a deep and major part of anybody's psyche, but he was defining his religion by his sexuality, not his sexuality by his religion. Do you see the distinction?
I see the distinction, but I think it's a very difficult conflict to
It certainly.
resolve.
I'm not saying he didn't have a terrific conflict, but I'm saying that if he was putting his purpose in life as an Orthodox Jew in the prime place, then he would have persisted with the therapy and done what he could. But I think he was right to divorce.
I think he would say that he had tried to do that for many, many years. He tried to contain his sexuality within a Haredi community, and eventually the pressure was just too much. I want to come now to this clear shift in the Jewish population in Britain today. There is a movement towards Haredi, towards what is pejoratively called ultra-Orthodoxy. Quite a substantial shift. How do you account for that, Avraham?
There's an attraction, a way of life. People see a very strong sense of community and support, where the values and principles are based on an understanding of Torah as being an eternal truth, and not one that changes according to the fashion. Young people are disillusioned with that sort of superficiality and are searching for real meaning, and they find it in Charedi Judaism. the other communities actually diminishing. And, if it wouldn't be for the Haredi community, there wouldn't be a Jewish community in the future.
We're not dying out as a community. It is true that Torah Judaism, the kind of Judaism that you represent, though it may be growing, it is really at the margin of modern Jewish life. But
I think
I don't think
it's at the core of Jewish life.
In the past, it might have been a margin, no more.
Numerically, the vast number of Jews are not Haredim.
But they're not reproducing themselves, and they're intermarrying. They don't value their Judaic identity.
In the last figures of the Board of Deputies, it said that to every 7 funerals within the progressive community, there is 1 marriage. You're disappearing.
Well, it's true that the Haredim do have more children than non-Harediv Jews, but that doesn't mean that the community is going to die out and you're our only insurance policy for the future. I don't think the Jews will die out.
No, they won't die out because the growth of the community will come.
The majority of Jews are like me, that they want to live in the modern world. It's not that the modern world is superficial or tantalizing. It's that we are products of the Enlightenment. I want to open my mind to modernity, and the Haredim want to close their minds to modernity.
I beg your pardon.
Mrs. Myer.
Yeah. I've got a dishwasher, I've got email, I've got a computer. We've got about 5 computers in the house. We do supervise our grandchildren when they come over. Yes, because I want to make sure they're not getting into trouble.
It is a more enclosed world than that. The very fact that most Haredi families do not want to send their children off to ordinary universities and for them to enter the professions in the way that most Jews do is symbolic of this. Of course, you're right that strictly Orthodox Jews drive cars, they use the internet, they have mobile telephones, but they do want to be restrictive in these spheres. And they also don't want their children contaminated by the modern world. Do you think that's an unfair description?
No, I think that's reasonable.
But Avraham, if you take the university issue, why would Haredi families deprive their children of higher education in order to cut them off from what they feel might be influences that will turn their lives in the wrong direction? Is that not a huge price to pay?
It is, and it's a price well worth paying.
But you see, I think it's a price that we have won in the modern world, that we can send children to universities.
Well, actually, I think
in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, this was not so until the period in the Enlightenment.
What's the point? You end up with a lot of debt and you may not get a job out of it anyway. What good's university?
The purpose of a university is to encourage students to think, to be critical, to be informed. That's the purpose of university education. And to deprive children, Jewish children, of that opportunity, I think, is a scandal.
Avraham may Dan have hit a point here. He says that the purpose of university is to get people to think, to apply critical thinking to all sorts of areas of life. And if Haredim children come back from university with that sort of critical analytical skill, they may apply those principles to their life in the community and to the beliefs they hold.
That's not my concern. My concerns are rather the values and the decadence that exists in some of those and the drug taking that they're going to come home with. In fact, our children also study. We're known as the people of the book and spend a lot of time studying. People who are learned are very revered and the most highly respected.
Would it be fair to say that men who are learned are highly revered because the same opportunities aren't always given to women?
The role of men and women in the Haredi community and in the Jewish community, they're equal but different. When we talk about the continuation of the Jewish community, it is the women who play the role and are going to ensure that we have Jewish grandchildren.
One of the great victories for Jewish women in the modern world is the fact that they have won opportunities for education, for professional careers, for achieving equal roles within the Jewish community and in Jewish religious life. Jewish feminism has, since the 1970s, fundamentally changed the role of women and given them opportunities they never had before. Now, the Haredim cannot accept this, and I think it is a great pity.
That's not the case. I'm married. My wife is the headmistress of the school, and she was actually awarded an OBE for services for education. She's a wonderful educator, but she sees her job foremost as her family and her children.
Mrs. Myer.
I've written 3 books. They're historical fiction and they entail quite a lot of academic research. I think a woman's primary function is to create the home because Judaism is a very home-based religion. I know the men go to synagogue. A woman doesn't have to. Her responsibilities creating the home are regarded as paramount. She creates a Jewish atmosphere. She teaches the young children. She fosters their spiritual and character development, as well as the ordinary running of a home. And it's a major job, and it's recognized as one within the community. I'm not saying there isn't male chauvinism. There is, because anytime you have separate, there's always the tendency to make it unequal. But the women are proud of their role.
Yeah, but it must be borne in mind that women in the Orthodox world cannot be rabbis, they can't be cantors, they can't occupy fundamental roles of leadership in the synagogue itself, though obviously women are venerated, regarded as homemakers, mothers. That's all very positive, but there is not the same freedom of opportunity.
But I don't know if we need the opportunity. I mean, are you so jealous of me that I can have babies?
No, not at all. I'm saying that women...
Well, exactly. But why should I want
to
to go out and have a job when at the same time there's a home that needs to be made?
I'm not saying any woman should have a job. I'm saying that women should have the same opportunities to have a job.
Well, we must bring this programme to an end. I want to ask each of you a final question. What would you say if a son of yours said he wanted to leave the community, Mrs. Myer?
Well, you don't actually get told. I have had a son who dropped out. I think he found the life very attractive. Certainly the boy and girl thing is a lure to children who are attracted by that sort of thing. I found it distressing. He was extremely unpleasant in many other ways, so I just found it aggravating. Some parents will bend over backwards and give them unconditional love.
What did you do?
I let him know where he stood. He was rude, he was contrary. I mean, he was a typical teenager, but we don't have that many typical teenagers in our community. His behavior was on a secular model, not on an Orthodox Jewish model. I may say, by the way, that he has dropped back in again.
Dan, what would you say if your son came to you and said that he wanted to join a Haredi community?
I would say, this is your decision, and I give you my blessing. But it's not what I would choose. I would feel, in a sense, that I had failed as a parent to show him that there is another way.
Avram?
All my 7 children are married, and my problem is they're all more religious than I am. They all had choices, all went through their teenage years, and the way they responded, they became more religious. I'd have preferred they were just like me, but that's life.
Well, that's all for this week. My thanks to Mrs. Henya Myer, Avraham Printer and Dan Cohn-Sherbok. I'll be back at the same time next week. Do join me.